My grandfather promised me the farmhouse and land he built with his own hands, but after his death I discovered my brother had forged papers and stolen everything. When I saw a for sale sign hammered into the yard, I knew he was cashing out our family's legacy. I had nothing but old letters, neighbors' memories, and my determination. But when I exposed his fraud, the truth didn't just save the house, it destroyed him. When my grandfather died, I thought the hardest part would be learning to live in a world without him, without his raspy laugh over morning coffee, without the stories he told about the house he built with his own hands, without the warmth of knowing that no matter how hard life got, there was always a place I could come back to where I truly belonged. But I was wrong, because the hardest part came weeks later, when I discovered that the house and the land he had promised me, his pride, his legacy, the piece of him that was supposed to live on through me, had been stolen before I even had a chance to claim it. For as long as I could remember, Grandpa had made it clear the old farmhouse on the hill and the acres of land around it were mine. He had said it in front of my parents, in front of my brother, in front of neighbors who nodded and smiled. Everyone knew it was meant for me. "One day, Rachel," he used to say, patting my hand, "you'll make this place your own, and it'll always be home." Those words carried me through college, through the brutal nights of working 2 jobs, through every moment I felt like giving up, because I knew one day I'd have a foundation, a future, something solid to build on. But after his funeral, when the will was read in that stuffy lawyer's office, I felt my chest cave in as the lawyer calmly explained that the property, worth at least $400,000 by today's market, was not mine. According to the documents, it had already been transferred to my brother months earlier, with a signature that looked shaky but official. I remember the sound of my breath catching, the way my hands clutched the arm of the chair so hard my knuckles turned white, while my brother sat across from me, smug, adjusting his tie as if this was nothing more than business. He didn't even look ashamed. When the lawyer closed the file and offered condolences, my brother leaned back, gave me that smile I had hated since we were kids, the one that said I win, you lose, and murmured, "Guess Grandpa changed his mind." But I knew better. Grandpa hadn't changed his mind. He couldn't even hold a pen steadily in those last months, his hands too shaky from medication, his voice trembling when he spoke. There was no way he had signed those transfer papers on his own. My stomach churned as suspicion clawed at me, and that night I drove out to the farmhouse just to see it, to remind myself it was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. The windows were dark, the porch sagging, but it still smelled like Grandpa's pipe tobacco, still felt like the place I had called home more than my own apartment ever did. And then, as I stood in the yard, I saw a for sale sign hammered crookedly into the ground. My heart dropped. My brother wasn't just stealing the inheritance, he was selling it, cashing out Grandpa's life's work for quick money. Rage and grief tangled inside me until I could barely breathe. I yanked the sign out of the dirt and hurled it across the yard, my scream breaking the silence of the night. In that moment, I swore to myself I would not let him get away with this. He thought he had silenced me with forged papers and smug smiles, but he didn't know I had grown up listening to Grandpa's stories, his warnings, his lessons, and I remembered things my brother didn't, where the real papers were kept. The neighbors who had witnessed his promises, the letters he used to write when his hands were steady. My brother thought this was over, but I knew it was just beginning, and if he wanted to steal my future, he was about to learn that I wasn't the little sister he could push around anymore. The days after I saw that crooked for sale sign were some of the darkest of my life, because it wasn't just about losing a house or even land, it was about losing the one thing that tied me to my grandfather, the one anchor I had left after his death, and realizing that the person who had stolen it wasn't a stranger, but my own brother, the boy I'd grown up with, the one who used to chase fireflies with me in that same yard, the one who promised as kids that we'd always look out for each other. Now he was cashing out on everything we had shared, and I was left standing in the wreckage, powerless. I tried to tell myself maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked, maybe there was some explanation, but every call I made to him went unanswered, every text I sent was ignored, until finally he showed up at my apartment one night, not to talk, not to explain, but to gloat. He stood in the doorway with that same arrogant smirk, a stack of glossy brochures in his hand advertising the farmhouse as a prime investment opportunity. He tossed one on my table like a challenge, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he said, "It's already done, Rachel. Grandpa gave it to me fair and square. You should move on." My hands shook as I picked up the brochure, staring at the polished photos of the house I loved more than anywhere in the world, now reduced to a sales pitch, my grandfather's legacy twisted into profit margins. "He would never sign it over to you," I spat, but my brother just shrugged, his eyes cold. "Well, the papers say otherwise. And papers are what matter." That night, after he left, I collapsed onto the floor of my apartment, sobbing until my chest hurt, because deep down I knew he was right about one thing in the eyes of the law. Papers were everything. My grandfather's promises, his words, his intent, they meant nothing without proof, and proof was what I didn't have. I stopped sleeping, haunted by the thought of losing that house forever, imagining strangers tearing down the porch, painting over the walls where Grandpa had marked our heights as kids, ripping the land apart to build something sterile and lifeless. Friends tried to comfort me, but their voices felt hollow. Some told me to let it go, that it was just a house, that fighting family wasn't worth it. But they didn't understand, it wasn't just a house, it was my future, my connection to the only person who ever believed in me without condition. The more I thought about it, the deeper the despair sank in until I started questioning everything about myself. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I didn't deserve it. Maybe this was why my brother had gotten away with so much when we were kids, because I had always been the one to back down, to swallow the hurt, to tell myself it wasn't worth the fight. But then, one night when I couldn't sleep, I pulled out the old shoebox of letters Grandpa had written to me when I was in college. I unfolded one, the paper yellowed and fragile, and tears blurred my vision as I read his words. "Rachel, the farmhouse will always be yours. Never let anyone take from you what you've earned." My hands tightened around the letter, my despair slowly hardening into something else, something sharper. If Grandpa had believed in me, then I owed it to him to fight. I dug deeper into that shoebox, finding notes, sketches, even receipts for repairs he had made, all with his name signed steady and clear, the same signature I knew had been forged on those transfer papers. The contrast was undeniable. My brother thought I was broken, beaten, ready to walk away, but he had underestimated me. I wasn't finished. Not yet. And as I sat there surrounded by Grandpa's words, his handwriting, his love etched into every page, I felt the first flicker of resolve. My brother had stolen my inheritance, but I still had something he didn't, truth. And I was going to find a way to make it matter. When I woke up the next morning, the letter from Grandpa still lay unfolded on my kitchen table, its ink faded, but his words sharp enough to cut through the fog of my despair, and as I traced his handwriting with my fingertip, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I let my brother sell that house, it wouldn't just be about money or property, it would mean allowing him to erase Grandpa's legacy and everything he had stood for, and I wouldn't, let that happen. I needed a plan, not just anger, not just tears, but something that would hit harder than his smug grin and his forged papers. So I started with the basics evidence. I spent days combing through every drawer, every box of Grandpa's things I had salvaged after the funeral. I found canceled checks from contractors he'd hired for renovations, receipts for lumber signed with a steady hand, photographs of him standing proudly by the new barn he built just a few years before his health declined. All of them dated long after the so-called transfer of property that my brother claimed had happened. The timeline didn't add up, and the more I found, the stronger my case became. Still, I knew documents alone wouldn't be enough. Courts are swayed by witnesses and memories and stories that bring the truth to life. So I started visiting neighbors who had known Grandpa for decades. Old Mr. Collins, who lived 2 farms over, remembered vividly the day Grandpa told him, "This house will be Rachel's one day. She's the only one who cares about it." Mrs. Ramirez, who brought over casseroles whenever Grandpa was sick, pulled out her own journal where she had written down a conversation they'd had just months before his death. "Rachel is going to take care of this place. I don't worry about it because she loves it as much as I do." I recorded their statements, my phone filling up with the voices of people who had loved him and who knew his intentions as clearly as I did. But the most shocking discovery came when I dug into county records. Sitting in that dusty courthouse, flipping through files, I found the official deed transfer, stamped, dated, signed, but the notary's name made my blood run cold. It was the same friend my brother had been partying with for years, a man who had been fired once for shady financial dealings. I dug deeper, and sure enough, there were irregularities in his record, complaints of falsified signatures that had been quietly dismissed. My hands trembled as I snapped photos of every page, because now I didn't just have Grandpa's words, I had a thread that tied directly to fraud. The realization was electrifying, but terrifying too, because if I was right, my brother hadn't just stolen from me, he had committed a crime, and exposing him could ruin him completely. Part of me hesitated, the little sister in me still craving some sliver of family, but then I remembered his smirk, the for sale sign, the brochures tossed in my face, and the hesitation hardened into resolve. This wasn't about protecting him anymore, it was about protecting Grandpa's name and everything he had built. I met with a lawyer, sliding the photos, the letters, the receipts across her desk, my voice shaking as I explained the story. She listened carefully, her eyes narrowing at the mention of the notary. "Rachel," she said finally, her tone both cautious and firm, "you don't just have a family dispute. You have a case for fraud. If we prove this signature was forged, not only can we nullify the transfer, but your brother could face criminal charges." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Part of me wanted to recoil, jail, police, public scandal, but another part of me, the part that had cried on my apartment floor, whispered that maybe that was exactly what he deserved. Still, she warned me cases like this were messy, they dragged on, and my brother would fight dirty. I left her office with a folder full of legal options and a head full of fire. That night, as I walked past the farmhouse again, I noticed lights on inside, shadows moving through the windows. My heart pounded as I crept closer, careful not to be seen, and what I saw through the dusty glass nearly made me gasp. My brother, sitting at the dining room table with two men in suits, flipping through a stack of papers. One of them pointed at the blueprints spread out in front of them, plans to tear down the barn, subdivide the land, and build modern condos. My stomach twisted with rage. This wasn't just about selling the house anymore. He was planning to destroy everything Grandpa had built. I stumbled back into the shadows, my phone raised, snapping photos of the plans before they turned the lights out. Every click of the shutter was another nail in his coffin. I realized then that time was running out. If I didn't act fast, bulldozers could be rolling in within weeks. But instead of fear, I felt a rush of adrenaline, because I wasn't just a grieving granddaughter anymore, I was a fighter with evidence, allies, and now a ticking clock. The next morning, I drafted an anonymous email and sent the photos of the condo plans to a local journalist who specialized in corruption and real estate scams. If my brother wanted to play dirty, then I was going to play smarter. I didn't know exactly how it would all unfold, but one thing was certain: the quiet girl who always backed down was gone, and in her place stood a woman ready to drag the truth into the light, no matter how many people got burned in the process. The morning the article dropped, my phone buzzed nonstop, each notification a spark of vindication, local headlines screaming about fraud, forged documents, shady land deals tied to my brother's name, his photo plastered across news sites with captions like, "Inheritance Scandal Uncovered." I should have felt triumphant, but instead my stomach twisted with nerves, because this was the part where the game stopped being whispers and family drama. It was public now, messy, dangerous, and irreversible. Within hours, my brother called me, his voice sharp with fury. "You think you're clever, Rachel? You just painted a target on your back. This isn't over." He hung up before I could reply, and for a moment I just stood there, phone trembling in my hand, knowing the war had officially begun. That afternoon, my lawyer called with news the county had opened an investigation into the deed transfer. The notary who had signed off on it had already been suspended for past misconduct, and my case was now bolstered by official suspicion of fraud. It was a crack in the armor, and I knew if I kept pressing, the whole thing could collapse. Days later, the showdown came in the form of a hearing at the county courthouse, a room filled with lawyers, board members, journalists, and neighbors who had come to watch. My brother arrived in an expensive suit, his arrogance intact despite the headlines, flanked by attorneys who sneered at me like I was nothing but a nuisance. But when the judge called us forward and my lawyer began laying out the evidence, their smirks faltered. She started with the letters from Grandpa, his steady signature on dozens of documents, then contrasted them with the jagged scrawl on the so-called transfer deed. The handwriting expert we brought in confirmed what I already knew: the signature on the deed wasn't Grandpa's. My brother shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar, but my lawyer wasn't done. She played the audio recordings of neighbors recalling Grandpa's words, each voice another nail in the coffin. He always said the farmhouse would be Rachel's. The judge listened intently, his pen scratching notes as the weight of testimony piled higher and higher. But the final blow came when the journalist we'd partnered with took the stand, holding up the photos I had snapped through the farmhouse window: blueprints of condos, contracts half signed. Proof that my brother wasn't preserving the property as he claimed, but preparing to sell it off for profit, directly contradicting his earlier statements. The room buzzed with murmurs, reporters' pens flying across notepads, cameras flashing as my brother's face turned crimson. He tried to interrupt, to shout that it was all lies, but the judge silenced him with a sharp gavel strike. And then it was my turn. My hands shook as I rose, but when I opened my mouth, my voice came steady, stronger than it had ever been. I told the court about Grandpa's promises, about the nights I stayed with him when he was too weak to climb the stairs, about the way he would sit me down and say, "This house is yours, Rachel. Promise me you'll take care of it." My throat tightened, but I pushed through, pulling out the final piece: Grandpa's shoebox of letters, his words etched in ink long before his decline, words no one could deny. When I finished, the silence was absolute. My brother's lawyer stammered, trying to discredit me, to argue that memories and letters didn't matter against legal documents, but it was too late. The damage was done. The judge announced that a ruling would be delivered soon, the deed frozen until further review, meaning my brother couldn't sell, couldn't bulldoze, couldn't erase what wasn't his. As I left the courthouse, cameras flashed in my face, journalists shouting questions, neighbors patting my shoulder, and for the first time I felt the tide turning. My brother stormed past me, his eyes like daggers, muttering, "You'll regret this," but the threat rang hollow now. Because in that moment, I realized the truth: he was no longer in control. The narrative wasn't his to spin. It was mine. The weeks that followed the hearing stretched like years, every day heavy with the weight of uncertainty, every phone call from my lawyer making my pulse race as I wondered if it would finally be the verdict or just another delay. I tried to focus on work, on scraping together money to pay bills, but my mind always drifted back to the farmhouse, to the porch where Grandpa used to sit with his coffee, to the sound of his voice telling me stories about the land, about how he built it board by board, nail by nail, and about how one day it would be mine. I clung to those memories like armor, because the waiting was torture, and part of me feared that despite everything, the law might still favor my brother, the one with money, lawyers, and influence. But deep down, I knew I had done everything right. I had collected evidence, I had rallied witnesses, I had exposed the fraud for the world to see. And then, one gray morning, the call finally came. My lawyer's voice was calm, but I could hear the triumph in it as she said, "Rachel, we won. The judge nullified the deed transfer. The property is officially yours." For a moment I couldn't breathe, my knees buckling as I sank into a chair, tears streaming down my face. It was over. Months of betrayal, nights of despair, all the humiliation and rage, it had led to this. My brother's theft had been undone, the farmhouse saved, Grandpa's promise restored. But the victory wasn't just mine. News of the verdict spread quickly, fueled by the journalists' coverage, and the community that had watched this battle unfold erupted with support. Neighbors stopped me on the street to congratulate me, some hugging me with tears in their eyes, telling me how proud Grandpa would be. For years I had felt invisible, dismissed, underestimated, but now I was the woman who had stood up to corruption, who had fought back against her own blood and won. My brother, on the other hand, faced consequences harsher than either of us had expected. The investigation into the fraudulent notary deepened, and as part of that, my brother's role in orchestrating the forgery became undeniable. The state pressed charges, and though he avoided jail by striking a plea deal, he was forced to pay massive fines, his reputation in shambles. The condo developers who had been circling like vultures pulled out of the deal entirely, citing legal instability, and suddenly the man who thought he was cashing in on nearly $500,000 was drowning in debt instead. He avoided me in public, but once, as I was leaving the courthouse after signing the final transfer papers in my name, he cornered me in the parking lot. His suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, his bravado gone. "You think you won," he spat, but his voice cracked on the last word. "You ruined me, Rachel." I looked him dead in the eye and said the words that had been burning on my tongue since the day this nightmare began. "No. You ruined yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it." Reclaiming the farmhouse wasn't just a legal victory, it was an emotional one. The first time I unlocked the front door with keys that finally belonged to me, I stood in the hallway for a long time, letting the smell of wood and dust and faint pipe smoke wash over me. The rooms were empty, the paint peeling, the floorboards creaking under my weight, but it felt alive again. I walked through each room, my fingers brushing the walls, imagining how I'd restore it. In the kitchen, I pictured sunlight streaming through new windows, laughter filling the space. In the barn, I saw children chasing each other, just like my brother and I once had before greed poisoned him. On the porch, I sat in Grandpa's old chair, the wood worn smooth, and whispered, "It's safe now." I kept my promise. But the story didn't end there. Winning the case gave me more than property, it gave me a voice. The journalist who had covered my fight published a feature about inheritance fraud, about how families are torn apart by greed and manipulation, and my story became a touchstone for others. Strangers reached out to me, sharing their own battles, thanking me for proving that even when the odds feel impossible, the truth can prevail. I never expected to be anyone's inspiration, but as I stood in that farmhouse, hammer in one hand and a bucket of paint in the other, I realized that maybe Grandpa had known all along, not just that the house was mine, but that I had the strength to protect it. As for my brother, he faded into the background of my life, a ghost of the man who once stood smug and untouchable. I heard whispers of his struggles, businesses failing, friends abandoning him, debts piling higher, but I didn't gloat. Revenge had already been served, not through spite but through justice. The scars of his betrayal will never fully fade, but I no longer carry them like weights around my neck. Instead, I wear them like armor, a reminder that I survived, that I fought, that I won. Now, when I stand on the hill at sunset, the farmhouse behind me glowing in the last light of day, I don't just see land and walls and memories. I see resilience. I see love. I see a legacy preserved not because it was handed to me, but because I fought for it with everything I had. And I know one thing with absolute certainty: my brother thought he could steal my future, but all he did was forge the fire that made me unstoppable. Grandpa once told me, "Never let anyone take from you what you've earned." I didn't. And I never will.